Howdy, all you delicious people. I am here today to review a movie called Carriers. So, while the new normal that was to go on, I tried to avoid doing anything that felt in that familiar territory or same vein. There might have been a lot of people that just decided to do that kind of movie, and I guess to maybe clickbait people or maybe to get people to be reminded of this whole scenario. I tried to avoid it for as long as humanly possible. This movie here was not something I actually chose, but once I actually started to watch it, I realized the strategy that was to be put into this movie. I realized that, wow, this is actually kind of an interesting story when eventually we are to see some characters who are to have, ripped away and torn themselves from other family members because of this illness that is going around. We start seeing these characters go and, wash down certain vehicles with Clorox and or bleach. Also, we have them go and make a plastic wall filled with this plastic and duct tape, duct taping and separating themselves from the sick in their vehicle. And I thought that was a really interesting approach to this film. Really, I think a lot of people who probably did actually do this movie are just so utterly happy that they had done this film, because this film was actually done in 2009. So I'm like, wow. So these people had a blueprint, and these people had a real true knowledge of what to do before this whole event was to happen. So luckily for them, I guess, they had a full, real, true heads up about this going on. So I guess lucky enough that they had done this movie, right? Going in on this movie, the very beginning of it makes you assume that this is some normal road trip movie, and eventually these people will find out about this illness later. No, these people are actually, from minute one, involved in what is to be this illness situation, but it just seems like a normal day to them because they have been going through this whole situation for far too long. So we have a strategy that goes into this movie, which I thought was fascinating. Not every single bit of this movie is 100% on the road. We do at some points have them stop at places and have the story kind of roll out that way. There is sometimes where there is hospitals where they are to go to. There are homes that they are trying to scavenge to find items for. But a bulk of this movie is on the road and eventually needing to strategize or to find people that can help them either get gas or get any number of other things to survive for desperation purposes. We also find some characters, while they are to talk, give us the rundown of who they think they are, or who they actually are, or how horrible they have had to been during this whole event. And we really start to see when people are to either get sick or either are to seemingly realize that death is close how honest they actually start to become, or just really how eventually some characters are at the lower bit of totem pole just because, really, yeah, just because you're smart doesn't mean that you have a say in anything. Like, if you're not the guy behind the wheel, you don't make the decisions. So, with that said, I really did actually enjoy this movie, but a lot of people could say that it's fairly slow, or a lot of people could say that this movie, uh, like, has some, like, issues with it, that, like, there is just a lot of driving time where I feel like we don't get enough, uh, time for us to really understand any number of these characters. Or really, when we do get backstory, it comes all in one time, and we're like, man, there could have been a consistent progression of, like, backstories and stuff like that for a bulk of this film. But anyways, I think it's that coveted time to go into that double five timed territory. Yeah, so there is quite a bit of strategy with this movie, and that's the thing that I enjoy about it the most, because it feels like a smart film, or it feels like a film that really isn't all about, like, oh, it's like us against them, and if someone is to get sick. No, like, it really is just like, well, here we are now, so, like, this is what we are going to have to forcibly deal with. and 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 not everyone is all bad. It's just, like, you need to, like, kind of, like, realize that they are trying to survive like you are. So eventually you have to realize that, that, hey man, like, I know you I know you threw something at me before, but, like, hey, let's try to bargain here. Like, when the chips are down, let's bargain. So, speaking of bargaining, it's about that bargain time to go into spoiler time. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, I would say that this movie is simple, hopefully for me to review, because it's just basically a road trip. There might be bits of dialogue that I do not put purposely in this review, just because more than likely I want to get to the main meat of some subjects, and plus it'd be nice to just have a shorter review out there that doesn't have to take, like, 40 to an hour minutes. So let's get into it. So the very beginning of this movie is to feel like a normal road trip. We have one of the characters, who is named Danny, who is getting a map out, and these characters are to have surfboards on the top of their car. And I'm like, what is the strategy in that? But the plan of this group is to go to the beach, and I don't understand why. So they are to try to figure out on this map where exactly the beach is. So we have this car who is to have spray painted on it Road Warrior, and I'm like, what are they, like, Mad Max fans? Because I guess technically, with what this movie is, it is similar to that. So Chris Pine, who is Brian, is driving the car. Who, whenever they are to be in the car, it seems that Brian is mostly driving. Chris Pine is to eventually, in this movie, keep going and drinking beer in this film, and to mention that beer tastes like pee, or tastes like piss. And I'm like, I'm like, man, that's a little goofy, but eventually he hits that line yet again. Uh, and so I guess he's just so frustrated and he has nothing better to say but to just complain about this beer because he has nothing left to complain about. So we have these road warrior uh, people go on this road to eventually be stopped by a guy who is named Frank. Frank is with a daughter who is named Jody. So they stop their car because this guy is like in the middle of the road. Frank mentions that him and Jody are out of gas, and Frank is mentioning like, "Hey man, like me and my daughter are out of gas. I would bargain with you for food and water, so that way we can exchange gas. Like I'd really appreciate it." But Bobby, who is of course Chris Pine's love interest in this movie, Bobby is to realize that Frank's daughter is actually sick. Frank's daughter has a medical mask on and it has blood on it. So Bobby is to immediately say that this girl is sick. So Bobby and them want nothing to do with anything of this guy. Immediately they start to try and drive off. And also Brian is mentioning that everyone needs gas. And Brian is not going to help him. Even though they do have a extra surplus of gas, they are not going to give that to him because like obvious reasons, like if they are to run out of gas, they will get stranded just like Frank did. So Brian and everyone starts to drive off. Frank goes and has a wrench in the back of his pants to go and chuck this wrench or try to smack this wrench into Brian's window, and the window cracks but doesn't shatter. So they crazily drive off, and I guess right after this situation, we have this car eventually just give out. Like all of a sudden, like there is pieces where they are dragging with this car, and eventually the car is to stop. They pop the hood to realize that, yeah, this car is toast. So Danny makes the consensus, well, you know what? Like, all that car needed back there was just gas. And Brian is like, yeah, the guy that threw a wrench at our car. Yeah, let's go back to him. Yeah, let's negotiate with him now. Yeah, let's try to... like, as we just, like, drove away from him, yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. But, really, they're making the consensus, well... and plus also, like, his daughter is sick, like, so they're like, well, if we're gonna go back there, then we're gonna have to quarantine this girl off, and we are going to have to really try to, like, clean, like, this guy's car heavily. So Brian, Danny, Bobby, Kate, because there's 4 of them, all go back to Frank's car to make an offer. Because Frank wants to go to a hospital that is nearby, because supposedly Frank had heard that there is a cure for this sickness, and Brian is like, well, where haven't I heard that before? Like, every spot supposedly has a cure for this illness. but there is no cure. There is no stopping this. But they take Frank to the hospital to help his daughter because it's the right thing to do. So Frank is to make a bargain with these people, and Frank and his daughter are forced to be in the trunk part of this car. Like it's like an SUV, so like it's an open like trunk part, so like you can easily see everything. So we have them kind of duct tape and plastic wall a separation between people in the very back and like the other four people. It seems that the tape and everything holds pretty decently, so there isn't a scarce thing where people are going to fear that this plastic wall is going to like get them to uh, get sick easily. So we have these people driving along, and people are to talk about how things are, and how, like, we have Brian, who is to mention that he thinks that he has some kind of like immunity to this whole illness. And Frank is like, oh, well, you have an immunity of this whole illness? Well, like, I'm sure that, like, you wouldn't mind if you go and kiss my daughter goodnight now for me, would you? And Frank is dead silent, and Frank is like, uh-huh, I thought so. So, we also mentioned that Danny was this guy who was to get this scholarship into Harvard, but coincidentally, at the exact same time, the whole entire school decided to shut down freshman year of this guy's college. I don't think there is much that was actually said about either Bobby or Kate, but eventually we have Kate, who is really starting to like push Danny to consistently be way more cautious, that eventually I think Kate almost wants to separate herself from a lot of people, even in this group, even with the people that she's been riding along with for so long. Every little thing about Kate is her being overly paranoid, but also there is some justifications in some part of this movie for what she is to like say to people. Bobby, we just try to have Bobby mostly talking to Frank's daughter, like trying to mention stuff about like boys and stuff like that, like trying to get this girl to forget that she is sick. And at some points, like, Bobby and this girl are to play like patty cake, and like Bobby is consistently trying to help this girl forget that she is sick, or to just have fun with this girl, so like they can have this kind of escapism for the time being. uh, Patty cake, like, because they're still over this like plastic like wall, so they can play like patty cake and it not break uh, the tape or the wall. So eventually we get a point here where this car eventually has to, I think, stop abruptly, and the tape kind of like gives way a tiny bit, but doesn't completely uh, like fall down. And Kate gets out of the car, and Danny mentions like, "Well, hey, like, if anything, like things are fine. Like the wall didn't break." like the tape held. So, but Kate is still like, man, we really need to, we really need to get rid of, like, get this Frank guy where he's going, so that way we can, like, just get him out of here. So, we push on to make it to the hospital, and so Frank takes his daughter to this one doctor, and we come to find out that this doctor is actually sick himself. He eventually shows himself to Frank, and Frank is like, oh my god, this guy is sick too. Like, should I really trust what he is going to do here? So, this doctor is just going and coming up with ways to actually just kill off all of his patients because they are to just die anyways. So Frank is to eventually have this doctor almost kill his child off, and Frank is to, like, do not do that to my daughter. Do not kill her off. Like, if anything, you can't do this to my daughter. And the doctor justifies to Frank, well, hey, it's better to, it's better to die quickly than to die slowly and in pain. So Frank grabs the gun away from Brian and is to hold the gun to this doctor. And so Frank is to take his daughter back from this doctor. And so here is when we have Danny, Brian, Bobby, and Kate all separate themselves from Frank. Danny is kind of going, or like the group is kind of going with the consensus, well, like, we were just going to have Frank with us until we got to this hospital, and then after that we were going to go our separate ways after that. So while Bobby, Frank, and Danny and Kate were all going into this hospital, before Jody was to go into the hospital with them, Bobby also stays back in the car. So we find Jody having difficulties breathing. There is an oxygen tank that is right next to her, and so Bobby is starting to realize that Jody is having difficulty breathing. So Jody is to almost fall back and in this trunk. So Bobby is quick to act. Bobby rips the plastic wall, takes the tape down, and Bobby is to take off the mask of Jody and put on the oxygen tank with the medical mask, with the medical breather thing on, so Bobby could breathe. The problem with that is that coincidentally, Jody is to cough at the same time and hit Bobby with a little bit of blood on her face. So Bobby is to see people coming, quickly retape and put the plastic wall back up, try to wipe the blood off her face with her coat, realize that there is blood on her coat, so Bobby tries to get rid of her coat and hopes that no one is going to notice that that Bobby had been touched with blood, and that Bobby hopes that she isn't actually going to get sick. So now that Frank and Jody have gone their separate ways, Jody actually needed to go to the bathroom, and as this group is to leave, and Frank is to realize the only spot for people to go to the bathroom is this porta potty, this porta john. So Frank is to tell Jody, hey, like, hey, honey, like, if you can go over there to those porta potties, like, I'm gonna wait for you here. Like, I will watch over you as you go there. Like, go ahead and use these porta potties, and like, I will watch over you, kind of thing. So, like, that is just kind of like a really just sad moment where like where like a father is just like I want to like help out my daughter and I want to like be there for her, but like a porta john could be any way of getting any kind of illness because it's a public restroom. Uh, that's when a lot of times I just completely would avoid ever using like a public restroom even before anything was to happen. Like I consistently avoided it, or I would just be like, no, I can wait. Like I can wait till I go back home and then I can use like my facilities there. That's how I always saw it. Like I never went to the bathroom like any time of like being in school or anything. Like I always just was like, no, like I don't have to go. Like I'll just wait till I get home and I'll be fine. Um, waiting. Uh, but yeah, so Frank and Jody are to separate from this group, and Brian and Danny and uh, Bobby and Kate are to all just drive off with the vehicle that Frank had. Like it was also kind of interesting when Frank and Jody were to eventually get this new were to eventually get Frank's car, and how they just started to just like chuck things off the vehicle, because really I guess if they figured, well, if this isn't something we absolutely need, then we're gonna just toss it off to the side, because justifiably we are not going to like take a risk with certain items on this car that eventually are going to fall off or are eventually going to make someone sick. So uh so now we have these four all driving off to uh, continue their travels and to continue trying to make it to this beach. So eventually, we have this group that is to eventually stop somewhere, and eventually this group is to be stopped by another group. This other group has these hazmat like equipment on, and eventually these hazmat people, eventually holding guns on this entire group, eventually want some of the people in the group to strip down to see if they are sick or not, and both of the women take off their clothes first, and we find out that Bobby is actually going to be one of the sick. Where there were plenty of times where Brian was trying to get intimate with Bobby, and Bobby was trying to avoid any contact with Brian. Eventually mentioning that she is dirty, or that like, because they kind of like I think wrestle onto the ground, and Bobby is mentioning how like dirty she is, or how like she doesn't want any like she doesn't want to like touch the ground, when both Brian and Bobby are just kind of wrestling around or having fun. So, and there is kind of these like telltale signs that it seemed that Bobby was consistently trying to distance herself from the rest of the group. But she didn't actually say that she was sick. She didn't actually tell anybody anything. And she hid this from everyone. So, when we are to get to this moment where it is to be revealed that Bobby is to be sick, we eventually have these hazmat people all run away. But during this whole commotion, we also have... or no. Wait, that happens afterwards. It doesn't happen now. So, the group is to get back in their vehicle. And oh, wait, here's an interesting part. Like, there were a point where they were to see another car on the side of the road, and the group of four was to go and just try to siphon off gas from this person's car. Danny was to go and get to the driver's seat and open up the driver's seat car to realize that the guy in that driver's seat was actually sick. And so Danny had to scramble to get the car keys, and all of a sudden this sick person starts to move, and Danny starts to freak out and closes the door, and Brian is like, dude, what are you freaking out about? And then all of a sudden he starts to see the hand just kind of move on the glass, and Bobby's like, oh, okay, I got it. So, did you get the keys so that we can get this gas and get the heck out of here? So, like, that was kind of an interesting moment, but, so, we have this group get back on the road and drive on, and we start to have, like, Kate, who is looking at Bobby and, like, assessing every single touch that she is to make in this car, that every single touch of hers is leaving an imprint on the car, like, meaning, like, when Bobby is to, like, press down on the seat, you can see a fingerprint left there that I thought was, like, I'm like, man, that's really interesting to kind of, like, give people, like, the paranoia of thoughts. So, eventually we have people, like, starting to talk as if everything is normal yet again, to just kind of break the silence. And, like, Bobby starts talking, and so Brian eventually tells Bobby, like, you know what, get out. And Bobby's like, okay, I'll go ahead and I'll sit back in the back. Like, I'll go and I'll be just like Jody was, and they'll, like, put a plastic wall on and, like, quarantine her off. And Brian is like, no, that's not what I said. Like, get out of the vehicle. Get out. You lied about, like, you hid that you were sick to this entire group, and you, like, put all of us at risk selfishly, and, like, you weren't being honest with us when eventually you found out that you could quite possibly be sick. So, get out. Get out of this vehicle. The next stop of town is way down the road. Get to walking. And, like, we have Brian, who goes from lovey-dovey Brian to now just this guy that is just lost everything, and, like, is having the woman that loved him lie to him, and, like Brian is just like, God, I am just so done with this world. Like, you can just tell that he's just like, he's dead inside at this point, that basically, because of how much he loved this woman and how he does not eventually want to see her wither away and die. I think that's the main reason why also, like, he's just cutting ties with her now, because it's like, dude, you're going to wither away and die, and I don't want to watch you do it, so I'm going to tear myself away from you and just go on. And so we have them going back on the road and drive off some more. And so we lead eventually to have this group start to run low on gas, start to be driving with fumes. They eventually see some car up ahead, so Brian is to swerve to cover up this entire road, and so Danny goes out to try to negotiate with these people and say, hey, like, we're out of gas. If anything, hey, like, we're more than willing to just kind of help you guys out and whichever. And we have these two women in this car that are like, well, that's great and all, but if you guys could just move out of the way, like, that would be great. And Danny realizes that they have some religious symbol on the rear view mirror of their car, and so immediately, like, Danny is pulling all kinds of strategies and tricks to try to persuade these people. Danny mentions that he's a devout Christian, and he's like, how could you not help us? Like, how could you turn a blind eye? And, like, these women are like, don't do that. Like, don't try to pull that card on us. And Danny's like, and also, like, my girlfriend Kate is pregnant, and we, like, desperately need gas, just a little bit of gas, just to get us to the next city. Like, that's all we need. And it just gets to the point to where Brian is realizing that these people are not going to take the bait. So Brian just goes in guns blazing and just starts putting bullet holes into this person's windshield. And one woman ends up getting killed. The other woman tries to get out of her car and starts shooting up Brian. Brian ends up getting shot in the leg and falls over, but eventually this woman is to get killed also. So they take the gas afterwards, and now Brian is in the back seat trying to like, fix his wound, but then, like, go back there and just kind of, like, rest because of his wound. So Danny is to go into this house to try and find any number of medication or medical things to be able to fix Brian's wound. And so Danny goes in to try and look through this home and scavenge, and he is to find one guy in his bed who had gotten very sick. And bizarrely, this dog is to just start chewing and biting on this man's corpse. Eventually, we find this dog is actually a very aggressive dog. He seems to be kind of snarling and growling at Danny. And so Danny kind of slowly but surely starts to grab a lot of the drugs that this guy was to have, so they could probably use for later. So Danny eventually drops one of the medications. The dog ends up jumping onto Danny while Danny had found this double-barrel shotgun in this home. So Danny tries to stall off this dog, and eventually the dog is to get shot by this pistol and killed, sadly enough. So, because this dog was wild, and so they had to put it down forcibly. So, wait. more than likely the dog might have been killed by the double barrel shotgun, but I was trying to figure out, well, how, but the dog sadly dies. Either way it dies. It's sad, but it is what it is, because it's either kill or be killed. So because Danny like pushes it off and then fires. Like, I was thinking that somebody else came to the fray, but that doesn't happen. So Danny comes back with what he can, and we eventually find out that eventually Brian was to mention early on that he was immune, but I guess that was actually incorrect. Brian eventually does actually start to get seemingly symptoms of feeling ill, and Brian realizes that he is probably going to die at some point soon, because infection and all kinds of things from the bullet wound. But so eventually, here is where Brian starts to become really honest with the rest of the group. How Brian eventually tells Danny like how crappy of a thing that both him and his brother had to leave his parents, saying that they were going to get help for them, and kind of just ran off. Like, they ran from them because they were sick and there was nothing that they could do. And how crappy that was of them to forcibly need to do that, and how Brian needed to make that decision and needed to do that, and I guess Brian is really just holding that over on Danny, because it's like, yeah, like, I had to do that, like, I had to tell our parents that, and like, you just got to skate away with not having to get your hands dirty. I guess Brian has had to get his hands dirty a lot in this new situation where Danny is just the smart guy who is to be the smart ass, and like think that he knows everything and thinks that he is helping the group, but actually Brian is doing a lot more helping than actually anyone else is. So we get to the point where Brian eventually is to take the keys from this car and to almost want to decide to separate himself from Danny and Kate. And Brian takes the keys, and so Danny wants, of course, the keys from Brian, but Brian does not want to give up the keys. And we are starting to more and more like see that eventually this is going to end in someone's death. It's eventually going to end in like Brian wanting to push Danny for Danny to kill Brian, and so eventually this just leads into a forcible situation that is to end in death. So let me pause here for a second. All right. So I wanted to just kind of like reset here for a second, because normally I always go into like a reset mode for a lot of reviews, because like I just wanted to take a second to just kind of like, okay, like, is there anything left in the barrel of the gun for me to mention here before we are to like call this a wrap? Because there's sometimes where like I feel that I need a moment in some reviews. So Brian is to eventually be at the point in the back seat, but then eventually he gets pushed back further into the vehicle and quarantined off from both Kate and Danny. And so we have the group decide to sit by the fire, and eventually both Brian or Danny and Kate start to realize, you know what, like, Danny starts to realize that I think he needs to do the exact same thing that Brian had done to Bobby. So Danny goes into the vehicle with Kate and is to assumingly drive off, leaving uh, leaving Brian by this fire to uh, just to eventually just die off. Brian is now like putting a blanket on himself and is just like trying to get as healthy as possible. So Brian is sleeping by this fire, and Danny and Kate are going to leave Brian there to die. So Danny and Kate make it to the car. Brian is like, "Where are you guys going?" Like, "Hey, like, I think it's going to be a little bit hard for you guys to make it anywhere when you guys don't have the keys." Danny is demanding for the keys, pulls a gun out on Brian, and Brian is like, "Well, hey, if you want these keys, you're gonna have to get them. You're gonna have to come and get them from me." So Danny has to fire into his own brother and take the keys from him and drive off, sadly. Uh, so we eventually see that both Kate and Danny are the only two that are left alive. Supposedly, we don't know what is to happen with Bobby. But yeah, and that's the way that this movie is to end. In the very beginning of this movie, and it showcases at the very end, and here's the thing that I completely left off. Danny eventually, when they are to transition from the Road Warrior to then their new vehicle, he grabs this picture. I think Jody is to ask Danny what this picture is to symbolize, and so when Brian is to get shot at the very end of this film, they are to reflect back on that picture and a fun time that both Danny and Brian were to have, and like showcase how far that this relationship between these two brothers have fallen. So yeah, kind of symbolism, or kind of kind of an interesting way about approaching this movie. But I think I'm going to approach my way out of here. I didn't realize I was going to be spending this long to review this film, so I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.